Welcome. Welcome back to my channel Conquer the Fear. In this video we are going to discuss about what is Spring Boot starters, how are they useful to us, what are the different Spring Boot starter available, okay, and how the life was before and after this particular Spring Boot starter was introduced. So we are going to discuss all this in this video. So watch this video till the end, and also if you are on this video to just make your knowledge more broader, then this is the right video for you. And if you are exploring on Spring Boot videos, please watch this video till the end. Now we will first discuss about what exactly the Spring Boot starter is about. Now Spring Boot starter is going to be a fundamental concept of Spring Boot framework. Okay. Now this is going to simplify and accelerate your development for Spring Boot application. Now at the core, the Spring Boot starters are nothing but the pre-configured set of dependencies. Okay, so that you can include in your project. So each of this particular specific area you can include, like web development, whether it is data access, security, testing access. So it is going to be giving you a curated collection of necessary libraries, frameworks, and the default configurations required for your particular use cases. Okay, so that is what the Spring Boot starter is about. Now think of them as one stop shop, okay, where you have the specific type of applications or a features. Now instead of you trying to manually add those particular individual dependencies and worrying about what is the compatible version, you just have to include one single starter dependency, and the Spring Boot will automatically pull everything whatever is needed along with the sensible configuration, the default configuration. Now Spring Boot starters are going to follow some patterns. Okay, so it will start with Spring Boot starter, and where exactly after the star it denotes, like what kind of specific functionality you want that. Okay, so there are web dependency, there are data JPA dependency, there are test dependency. We can make use of it. Okay, now why or what are the benefits of Spring Boot starters? Okay, why are they useful? Now it has got very significant advantages. Okay, the very first thing is that it is going to simplify your development. Now the primary benefit is that, right, instead of you manually identifying and going to the lot of dozens of transitive dependencies libraries, you depend on one single starter that it will take care of everything. Okay, so this is going to reduce your pom.xml very drastically. Okay, in size and also in complexity. Now the second is reduced configuration overhead. Now there is a concept of convention over configuration. Now starter is going to come up with a sensible default configuration, so you doesn't have to write the extensive XML configuration, the Java based configuration for the common scenario. The Spring Boot is going to assume the reasonable default things. It is going to allow you to focus on your business logic. So that's where this particular feature gains an advantage. Then comes increasing your productivity and a faster development cycle. Now the manual setup and the configurations, the developer can get the project up and running much more faster, right? So the rapid development is a major reason why this Spring Boot is being adapted and is much more popular among the Java developers. Now then comes the consistency. Now the starter dependencies are compatible with the versions of the libraries are used. So it is going to give you a prevention where there was an earlier version conflicts, there were some integration issues. Okay, so this is more consistent, this is much more reliable when it comes to your project setups. Now the opinionated defaults, the Spring Boot is taken as an opinionated view, right? So it is going to provide the tested and the supported configuration for various technologies and the modules. So this is a guide where it will give you the best practices without being very restrictive or overly being worrying about. Okay, then we have the easy upgrades. Now when you're trying to upgrade your Spring Boot version, you are going to typically need to change the Spring Boot parent version only. Okay, then everything will, the compatible versions will be taken care and managed by the Spring Boot itself. Okay, so that's one of the important advantages when it comes to Spring Boot. Now, before the Spring Boot has been coming into the picture, right? Let's look at how the, it was before the life of, being Spring Boot introduced, right? So the traditional way, I would say. So what happened, like, we it used to have a manual XML configuration. So it was a hell life of things where, you used to do the Spring Boot. Your Spring Boot application heavily relied on your XML configuration. Let's say for the application context, the dispatcher servlet, for the beans, their dependencies, and the various components you are using. Okay, including the frameworks. Now these files could become very complex, very large, especially if you are on a very large project that makes you hard to read, maintain, and debug your application. So that was a very difficult situation with XML configuration. It was nothing more than the hell of them, right? So then comes the manual dependencies management. Now developer had to manually search, add the libraries, and to that particular specific compatible versions that has to offer. So it used to have a lot of version conflicts. Okay, so the libraries where has to be compatible with each other. It has to work. Okay, so there was a constant challenge. There was a different mismatch. So there was lot of runtime error used to come. Then there was a boilerplate dependencies for functionalities like web development. It used to have a lot of Spring MVC jars, Jackson jar, Tomcat jar. You have to add it in your pom.xml. So now you doesn't have to add that with the Spring Boot starter. Then there was an embedded server. So there no embedded server. So basically to run your application, you typically had to deploy your application on an external servlet container, like you have Tomcat, you have Jetty, you have WebLogic, or any other things. So there was another added steps which was there after your development. So you used to do the deployment process. Now tedious setup, right? So it is going to be one of the new, let's say you are doing a new Spring Boot project, right? So it is going to take a considerable amount of time to set up your project, do the configuration, and you have to add the boilerplate code before you can even start doing the business logic, right? So this was one of the important reason we shifted to the Spring Boot, and this is where this Spring Boot addresses this particular problem. So we will look into the further things in the slides. Now if you look at this particular thing, let me explain, like what use the traditional manual dependencies used to be. Now if you see here, there's an XML configuration you had to manually add it in the pom.xml. Okay, so it was kind of a very big things. You need to add rest application related, JSON related, all other things. Now you see the amount of configuration dependencies you had to add it. It was humongous, right? So this was a challenge which it addressed. Now if you see, the challenges are like, one is the version management we already discussed, the transitive dependencies, the boilerplate code. Now it used to also have the configuration as well. So you have to add the dispatcher configuration, the view resolver, the message converters, etc. You have to find out the versions compatible to all those particular versions. So one single change or one single incompatible version used to run your application to the runtime errors. Okay, so the all the transitive dependencies are also used to pull in, right? So you have to manage that and you have to debug that, right? So it was very cumbersome. Now after now let's look at the scenario after the Spring Boot has been introduced, right? So what we already discussed, there is a convention of convention over configuration and the auto configuration. So Spring Boot is going to reduce your explicit configuration. It will auto configure your application based on the jar libraries that are present in your class path. It will include your starter libraries, like it will assume that your application is a web one or what kind of it, right? And then it will add those particular dependencies. Now you have a very simplified starter dependencies. So you all the related pom.xml configuration will be much more cleaner, easier to manage, and it will be a very transitive way for adding this particular dependency. So it doesn't have to add that manually for all the transitive dependencies. Embedded servers are added in the standalone. So your Spring Boot application can run on a standalone executable jar. So now the embedded servlet container, everything are included in it. So it is going to eliminate for you all to develop that particular jar and deploy it. So you can do the development and testing and everything in your same thing over there itself. So you just have to run it from your main method over there. Now this has increased the development speed. So the combination of auto configuration, starter, embedded server is going to make your application quickly start up, set up, and do the development, so that you can only focus on your infrastructure of business logic over there. Now you will have the production ready features. There are some features like actuators which will give you the monitoring, managing and inspecting kind of endpoints for your application when it is deployed on production. It can check your health, it can check your metrics, it can check your environment variables, it can check some information about your application. It will give you all things, so it is very easy to operate. Now this is one of the added advantage. Now you see, like in pom.xml, the moment you add that, you will have this particular all these transitive dependencies in a single starter web. Okay, now let's look at, like an example of how in the pom.xml, if you add one single starter web, what is the impact or what is the change after this particular Spring Boot has been introduced. Now you see here, there is only one single dependencies we have added over here, and this is going to take care of everything. This is going to uh, add those particular dependencies which are there, like the core dependencies. It will include the Spring MVC, web, starter, Tomcat, JSON, validation framework, your starter and everything. So this will include all your transitive dependencies, so you doesn't have to depend on manually adding that. Okay, now it will also do the auto configuration based on the presence of libraries in your Tomcat, in your class path, and automatically configure, like there is a dispatcher servlet. It will configure your Tomcat. It will give the message, JSON message converter. So it will eliminate here to manual configuration over here. Now let's look at how Spring starter works internally. So the magic of this particular is going to lie in between the a combination of the Spring Boot Spring core features and also the Spring Boot auto configuration mechanism. Now if you look at this particular thing, right, you have this particular dependency descriptor. Now when you add this starter like this, like the web, right, in your pom.xml, your build tool is going to automatically take care of the dependencies, the transitive dependencies, etc. Okay, then we have the particular uh, Spring Factory. Now this is one of the auto configuration jar files which will have the specialized information of, like the list of configuration files it should consider. So it will have all the list of auto configuration files listed in it. So this is one of the important file. Okay, so you should be aware of this particular thing, that is it will have all the combination of details. Then we have the enable auto configuration. Now this is going to be, now if you have heard of at the rate Spring Boot application annotation, this is important, where it will automatically tell the Spring Boot to start configuring automatically. So it will start check the Spring factory loader. It will scan all this particular Spring dot factories file which we already discussed, and that is found in your class path, and it will auto configure all this. Okay, so that's what it is going to do. Now then after that, it is going to check on the conditional missing beans or conditional things actually. So it will check all those particular conditional annotations over there. Now let's say you have condition on class, condition on missing bean. So each of this particular configuration class is typically added. So in condition on class, it is going to particularly check, like that particular certain class is present, then it is going to activate that particular thing, like dispatcher servlet will be added in, right? If it is the condition on the mean is bean is that particular not found, it is going to specifically remove from the other definition. So it is going to override the default configuration whatever it is there. There are some at the rate conditional, like at the rate conditional on property on expression. It is going to activate based on the properties of the expression that are there in. Then comes the bean definition and the configuration. Now, if all the condition of the configuration are met, it is going to proceed with defining and configuration your necessary beans that are required for your functionality and the business logic. Now, let's say you have a starter web is present. Now there is and no custom dispatcher is defined. Now Spring Boot will automatically configure your dispatcher servlet. It will add the Tomcat server, and then it will also configure your resolvers, the message converter, like JSON to XML or like that. So this will be taken care internally by it. Okay. Now let's look at the common Spring Boot starters which are there when it comes to Spring Boot, right? Now we already discussed about Spring Boot starter web. This is used for building the web applications. Let's say you want to develop the REST API, the Spring MVC. So there will be an embedded Tomcat which is there, right? Then comes the Spring Data JPA. If you are doing the development, the database connection with the help of Hibernate or with the relational database, you can use this particular dependency. Then comes the testing, that is used for writing the unit test cases, integration testing. So it will include the Spring Test, JUnit, Mockito, and if it is a Hamcrest, right? So it will include all this. Then comes the security. It is used for adding the authentication and authorization for your application to add the Spring security. Then comes the Spring Boot validation. Now there is a validation framework, sorry, security. Then comes the actuator part. So actuator is like adding the production related features like you already discussed, like monitoring metrics, health checks, and etc. Now then comes the validation. So you will have to have the validations of each Java objects using the Hibernate validator or other things. Then comes there is a mail dependency. So you can send some mail using this the framework, Spring Boot framework over there for the mail. Then comes the Redis cache, which is used for interacting with the Redis, that is an in-memory database. So used for caching and the session management. Then comes the AMQ, which is worked for send. It's a broker like RabbitMQ if you want to connect it. Then comes OAuth if you are using your application to build like OAuth 2 and then OpenID connect to the clients, right? So this is where we can make use of it. Now, let's break down the Spring Boot Starter web. Let's, for an example, take it. We'll take an example of Spring Boot Starter's web, and let's break down like what are the dependencies internally or the transitive dependencies we have to will get once we add this, right? So the very first thing is Spring Boot Starter. This is the core starter, and it I mean it is almost all the dependent things are dependent on it. So it's a fundamental features like auto configuration support, logging, YML configuration are done with the help of this particular starter. Then comes Spring Web. It is going to give you the web functionality, the Spring Boot core functionality. That is going to include your model views, MVC control things, the dispatcher servlet controller, view resolver. You have data bindings. So this is going to be the foundation of building your web application. Then we have WebMC. So Spring Framework, MVC framework is going to build on top of the web thing part we already discussed. So that it is going to handle your HTTP requests. It is going to map them to the controller method. It is going to render your views, etc. like that. Then comes your starter Tomcat. So it is going to embed your Tomcat. So it is one of the your Spring Boot application is going to run on the web application as a standalone jar without you need to deploy it on an external Tomcat. So it is going to handle your container aspect and everything. If you are adding any other dependencies, like for let's say you undertow is your preference, you can add those particular dependency and then you can exclude the default one as well. Then comes the Jackson data bind. So this is one of the powerful library for processing the JSONs So it is going to enable MVC to automatically convert to the Java objects to JSON, etc., or the JSON objects to the Java, vice versa. So it is crucial when you're building with the REST APIs. Then comes the validator. So it is going to bean validations. It is going to define some rules for the beans, like field is not null. You have some specific formats like email. You want some fields to be not null. You want some size to be restricted. Okay, so these are all things which we require. Now, if you, in short, if you see the web dependencies, especially, it is going to have the core Spring Boot environment related things. It is going to configure a Spring Boot framework for your web development. It is going to embed your Tomcat. It is going to have the JSON capability for processing that, and then the automatic bean validation is going to be taken care over here. Now, if you look at this particular project, I have created this Spring Boot project from the initializer from the web browser. I've downloaded that particular project and imported it. Now I have added the Spring Boot web dependencies, and I'm trying to explain you from the code level what are the things which we have discussed as a theoretical part. I'm going to explain you in the practical way. So if you look at this particular pom.xml, once you download this, you will see the pom.xml. Now if you look at from the top side, you will see the parent over here, which is of the Spring Boot starter. Okay, now after that, the project details, the library, the versions, and etc. Now if you see here, Spring Boot starter web. Okay, now you also see the Spring Boot starter data JPA, but let's focus on the web part. Now if you remember, let me go inside this. Okay, so we talked about the transitive dependencies, what are there. Okay, now if you go inside this, you will see this is again like all the Spring Boot version, the web thing, this is going to be that. And then if you see, there are different if you go a little bit down, you will see the dependencies, like see the starter dependency. So this is the Spring Boot starter is there, Spring Boot JSON is there, now Tomcat is there, your web dependency is there, your web agency. You recollect this what I have spoken earlier, that if you see all these particular dependencies are added. Now make a note of this particular version. See here, this is automatically been added by the Spring Boot once you add this particular starter, which is going to be dependent on your parent thing, right? So whatever the version you have added over here, based on that, the transitive dependencies will be added. Now this is going to be totally taken care by the Spring Boot itself. Okay, so you doesn't have to manually add this particular version over here. You doesn't have to find like what is a compatible version of this Spring Boot starter, and the JSON also you have to just add that, right? So there can be a different. Now just make a note of this. This is version of 43.4.5, right? Now you see the Spring Web is of different version, that is of something else, right? So these are different versions which you doesn't need to worry about. This will be automatically be taken care by the Spring Boot. Okay, I hope I was able to explain in details. Now, the last section, what we'll discuss about is what are the different common interview questions which are asked with respect to the Spring Boot starter. Okay. Now, if you look at this, right, the very basic question is itself the Spring Boot starter. What is Spring Boot starter? Now, this is very, very common and most frequently asked interview question. So, if you are attending this particular, interviews, or if you are preparing for an interview, you cannot afford to miss this particular questions. Okay, so make a note of all this particular level of questions which are asked. So, at the overall, if any questions are asked with respect to Spring Boot starter, you would be ready to answer it. Okay, so the very first question is what are Spring Boot starter? Why are Spring Boot starter useful? What problem do they solve? Okay. Can you give an example of common Spring Boot starters available? What is the naming convention followed over here? Now, what is the difference between the Spring Boot starter and what is the difference when you have that particular, just added as a Spring MVC as a dependency? How do starter is going to simplify your application development? Okay, So make sure at the basic level you have this particular question prepared. Okay, then let's look at the intermediate level of questions which are asked. Now, how does the Spring Boot knows which configuration to apply, when you need to include your starter, right? So you have to explain about the other auto configurations and the conditional annotations. Now, what is the role of the starter dependent starter the parent, right? You have to explain the purpose of the Spring dot factory file, why it is used, in what context it is used. Okay, now there is an at the rate enable auto configuration annotation, how it is related, how it is commonly found. Now how you can disable the configuration, right? How you can handle a specific version related compatibility with the help of this particular libraries which you have included. Okay, so this is the mid-level questions which are asked. Then comes the advanced level. Now when you would consider creating a common Spring Boot starter, right, custom Spring Boot starter, what are the difficult typical structure, what is we have to do, right? uh, Now let's say you have two starters which are conflicting. How would Spring resolve this? How would you handle this particular situation? Okay, discuss. You have to discuss about the configuration, auto configuration. What is the convention over configuration principle? Like the interviewer might indirectly ask you, like can you explain convention over configuration principle when it comes to auto configuration, right? So you have to explain what we have discussed. Then comes how do Spring Boot Starter impact your build time, your final architect size, etc. So you need to have a deep understanding. It is very very crucial for the Spring Boot Java developers to understand this and how it is going to simplify and enable your development. Okay, if this video was helpful to you, please share this video with the needy people. Also, if this video was helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit share and hit the bell icon. Thank you for watching.